Welcome to Episode 3 of Rise of a Nation, the Journey of Independence and Expansion. This episode is on Mexico.
Welcome back, deep divers. Today we're diving deep, way deep into, the history of Mexico's borders. And wow, what a story. I mean, you asked for this deep dive, and I have to say I'm pretty excited to really get into it.
Yeah, it's a fascinating one, that's for sure.
Absolutely. So we're going to go chronologically, from the early days all the way to the present, basically.
Absolutely.
So we'll be covering, things like the Spanish Conquest, the War of Independence, Texas, of course, the Mexican-American War, the Gadsden Purchase, and we'll even touch on the borders with Guatemala and Belize.
Sounds like a plan. Buckle up, it's a wild ride.
Yeah. Okay, so before we even get to Mexico, we have to rewind the clock a bit.
Way back.
Way back, yeah, to the time of the Aztecs. I was doing some reading on the Spanish Conquest and came across this fascinating detail. November 8th, 1519, Hernán Cortés and his translator, La Malinche, they meet with the Aztec Emperor Moctezuma in Tenochtitlan. So what's the significance of this meeting? I mean, was it just a how do you do, or was there something more going on?
Oh, there was definitely more brewing beneath the surface. I mean, picture this. Cortés representing this powerful, Spanish empire, ambitions of conquest, and then you have Moctezuma leading this mighty Aztec civilization, but also wary of these newcomers.
Oh, yeah. I can only imagine the tension in that room. But the Aztecs, I mean, they were a force to be reckoned with. So how did this meeting, how did it lead to their downfall?
Well, Cortés, he was a master strategist. And he had some key advantages. First off, the Spanish weaponry, cannons, muskets. These were far superior to anything the Aztecs had ever seen. I mean, imagine facing these weapons you've never even, conceived of.
Yeah, it'd be like showing up to a sword fight with a tank. Totally outmatched. But it wasn't just firepower, was it?
No, not at all. Cortés was also a master at playing politics. He exploited these existing rivalries between the Aztecs and other indigenous groups. He knew how to forge alliances, essentially turning their discontent into a weapon against the Aztecs.
Divide and conquer, classic. So the fall of the Aztec Empire, it wasn't just a military victory, it was a political chess game too.
Exactly. And the fall of Tenochtitlan in 1521, that marked the end of the Aztec Empire and the beginning of Spanish rule. The Spanish established New Spain, which was this vast territory, far beyond the boundaries of modern-day Mexico, actually.
And that Spanish influence, it didn't stop at borders, right?
No way. They brought their language, their religion, their whole social structure. All of that shaped the cultural landscape for centuries. I mean, think about it. Catholicism became the dominant religion, Spanish the language of power. It's amazing how these early events still resonate in Mexican identity today.
Yeah, it's like layers of history all built on top of each other.
Yeah.
But eventually those Spanish-imposed layers, they started to crack, right? There were rumblings of discontent that eventually led to a full-blown fight for independence.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The seeds of revolution were sown in the frustration of the Creoles. They were American-born Spaniards who, despite their heritage, were treated as second-class citizens, denied equal rights and opportunities.
I can see how that would breed some resentment. So when did things really boil over? Was there a specific event that marked the start of the War of Independence?
Well, our source on the Mexican War of Independence points to September 16th, 1810. That's the day a priest, Father Miguel Hidalgo, delivered his famous Cry of Dolores. It was this powerful call to arms, urging Mexicans to rise up against Spanish rule.
The Cry of Dolores. That's a name that definitely sticks with you. So was this revolution a unified movement, or were there different factions at play?
It was a complex movement, evolving over time with different leaders and different phases. Hidalgo's initial uprising, while inspiring, was ultimately unsuccessful. He was captured and executed in 1811.
Oh, wow.
But the torch of revolution passed to another priest, Jose Maria Morelos. He proved to be a very skilled military leader. He even managed to establish a Congress and issue a formal Declaration of Independence in 1813.
Wow, so they were really serious about breaking free.
Oh, absolutely.
But I'm guessing Morelos met a similar fate to Hidalgo.
Sadly, yes. He was captured and executed in 1815, and that marked a shift in the war, moving into a more fragmented phase, with guerrilla leaders fighting in different parts of the country.
So even with these setbacks, the desire for independence remained strong.
Oh, yeah.
So who kept the flames of revolution burning during this time?
Well, one key figure was Vicente Guerrero. He was a very skilled military leader, a symbol of resistance, especially among Mexico's indigenous and mixed-race populations.
It's amazing how even in the face of such adversity, the spirit of resistance persevered. So how did this long fight for independence finally come to an end? Did Spain just, give up?
Well, not exactly. There's a fascinating twist to this story. It involves a former royalist military officer, Agustin de Iturbide. He sensed the tide was turning, and, he switched sides. He saw an opportunity to position himself as a leader of an independent Mexico.
Wow, talk about a strategic career move. What made him change his allegiance?
Well, Iturbide was ambitious,
Yeah.
and he recognized that independence was becoming inevitable.
Yeah.
So in 1821, he formed this alliance with Vicente Guerrero, uniting former insurgents and royalists under this common goal of independence.
So this unlikely alliance between a former royalist and a revolutionary leader, that's what led to Mexico's independence.
It really is a testament to how quickly things can change during a revolution. Their combined forces proved too strong for the Spanish, and in September 1821, they marched triumphantly into Mexico City, effectively ending Spanish rule.
That must have been an incredible moment. So Mexico was finally free after centuries of Spanish rule.
Yes, but there's a little historical footnote here. Spain didn't officially recognize Mexican independence until 1836, 15 years after the war ended.
Wow, they really held on to that grudge. So by 1821, with independence secured, Mexico's borders were essentially set, right? Mirroring the boundaries of New Spain.
Yeah, you could say that.
Yeah.
But the story of those borders, it was far from over. New challenges were on the horizon, especially to the north, with a young and ambitious United States. The map was about to be redrawn once again.
This is where the story of Texas and the Mexican-American War comes in. What a roller coaster ride we have ahead of us.
You said it. We're about to dive into some of the most pivotal moments in Mexican history. Conflicts, negotiations, land deals, the whole shebang.
I can't wait.
So, all right, let's shift our focus now to the early 19th century. Mexico, newly independent, but already facing challenges along its northern frontier in, what we now call Texas.
Right, because at that time, Texas was still part of Mexico, right?
Exactly, it was, but with a growing American presence. See, Mexico had actually encouraged American settlers to move there, hoping they would help develop the region, which was pretty sparsely populated at the time.
I guess you could say that strategy backfired a bit.
Yeah, you could definitely say that. As more Americans arrived, they brought with them their own culture, customs, and, their views on slavery, which was a big one.
Right, because Mexico had abolished slavery in 1829.
That's right.
But a lot of those American settlers were from southern states, where slavery was still very much a part of life.
Exactly. So you have this clash of cultures, ideologies brewing right there on the border.
So was there a single event that caused this tension to erupt? Or was it more of a gradual escalation?
It was more of a slow burn, really. Tensions simmering for years. Disagreements over taxes, language, legal systems, you name it. Then in 1835, Mexican President Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, he moved to centralized power, revoking some of the autonomy that Texas had enjoyed.
It must have been a big deal for the Texans.
It was. Many Texans, both Anglo and Mexican, saw it as a threat to their liberties, their way of life. They were used to a certain degree of self-governance, and they weren't about to give that up.
And of course, this all culminated in the Battle of the Alamo.
Exactly. The Alamo became this powerful symbol of Texan resistance. And while the Alamo fell in March of 1836, it really galvanized the Texan cause. Just a month later, Texan forces, led by Sam Houston, they defeated Santa Anna's army at the Battle of San Jacinto, securing Texas's independence.
Wow, and to think Texas was an independent republic for 9 years before joining the U.S., it's wild to imagine the political landscape back then. But the story doesn't end there, does it? Texas still shared a border with Mexico, and the U.S. was getting more and more interested in expanding westward.
You're right. The U.S. was watching very closely this idea of manifest destiny, the belief that the U.S. was destined to expand across the continent. Well, that was gaining a lot of traction.
So was the U.S. just waiting for the right moment to annex Texas?
There were definitely those who saw Texas as a valuable prize, that's for sure. And despite warnings from Mexico in 1845, the U.S. did just that. They annexed Texas, making it a state.
That must have been a huge blow to the Mexican government.
Oh, it was. Mexico saw it as a hostile act, a violation of its sovereignty. And that annexation, well, that was the spark that ignited the Mexican-American War.
So it wasn't just about Texas anymore. This conflict, it expanded to a much larger territory.
It did. While the annexation of Texas was the trigger, there were these broader issues at play. The U.S. had its eyes on California and other Mexican territories, and President James K. Polk, well, he saw an opportunity.
An opportunity to take what he wanted, basically.
Pretty much.
So this war had some pretty significant consequences for Mexico's borders, didn't it?
Absolutely. Let's dig into some of the key events. First, there was the border dispute itself. Mexico considered the Nueces River to be the boundary, while the U.S. claimed the Rio Grande as the border, a disagreement over just a few miles of land. But it had huge repercussions.
Wow, talk about a border dispute escalating quickly.
Yeah, it really did. In April 1846, Mexican forces crossed the Rio Grande. They clashed with a U.S. patrol. This incident, known as the Thornton Affair, well, it gave Polk the justification he needed to persuade Congress to declare war on Mexico.
The Thornton Affair. It almost seems like a minor incident in the grand scheme of things. Was it really enough to spark a full-blown war?
Well, it was the catalyst that Polk needed. Remember, the desire for westward expansion was strong in the U.S. Many people saw this as a chance to acquire valuable territory.
So they used this border clash to justify a war that was, in many ways, already brewing.
You could say that. And the U.S. military, although smaller than the Mexican army, well, they proved to be very effective. They had some talented young officers, including future Civil War generals like Ulysses S. Grant and Robert E. Lee.
So this war was a proving ground for some major figures in U.S. history.
It was. Under the leadership of generals like Zachary Taylor and Winfield Scott, the U.S. Army achieved a series of victories, capturing key cities like Monterrey and Veracruz.
And eventually, this all led to the capture of Mexico City in 1847.
Yes. The fall of Mexico City was a devastating blow for Mexico. It forced them to the negotiating table.
And that's where the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo comes in. What were the terms of this treaty, and how did it impact Mexico's borders?
Well, this treaty, signed in 1848, resulted in Mexico ceding a massive amount of territory to the U.S. land that now makes up California, Nevada, Utah, and parts of Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, and Wyoming.
That's a huge chunk of land. Did the U.S. offer anything in return?
They did pay Mexico $15 million, which, considering the size and value of the land, seems pretty paltry in retrospect. They also assumed some debts that Mexico owed to U.S. citizens.
That's like the U.S. got a pretty good deal.
It was a significant turning point in North American history. It solidified U.S. control over a vast area and dramatically redrew the map.
So by 1848, the U.S.-Mexico border was pretty much set, right?
Almost. There was one final piece of the puzzle, a relatively small but strategically important strip of land that the U.S. still wanted.
Oh. Tell me more about this final piece.
Well, the U.S. had ambitions to build a southern transcontinental railroad, connecting the east and west coasts by rail, and this strip of land in present-day southern Arizona and Mexico, it provided the ideal route.
So they went back to Mexico and said, hey, we need a little more land for a railroad. How much will you take?
Pretty much. In 1853, James Gadsden, a U.S. diplomat and railroad entrepreneur, he negotiated the purchase of this land for Mexico for $10 million.
It's amazing how this relatively small transaction had such a big impact on the final shape of the border. It really shows how seemingly minor events can have lasting consequences. But we've been so focused on the northern border, we haven't even talked about Mexico's southern borders with Guatemala and Belize.
You're right, we haven't. And those borders, they have their own unique and fascinating stories. Let's shift our focus south now and explore those regions a bit.
Okay, so we've talked about, all the drama up north with the U.S., but what about down south? What about Mexico's borders with Guatemala and Belize?
Yeah, those borders, they have their own interesting stories, too, often tied to, colonial legacies and all that. Like the border with Guatemala. On a map, it looks pretty straightforward, almost like someone just drew a straight line.
Right. Just took a ruler and went for it.
Yeah, if only it were that simple. But that seemingly simple line, well, it's actually the result of years of negotiations and boundary delimitation.
So there's more to it than meets the eye.
Definitely. And a big factor was, you guessed it, Spanish colonial administrative divisions.
Right, because we were talking earlier about New Spain being this huge territory.
Exactly. And within New Spain, they had different administrative units, kind of like provinces or states, and Guatemala was one of them.
So when Mexico gained independence, they kind of inherited these old internal borders.
Yeah, basically, but not without some, disputes and adjustments along the way.
Makes sense. So those colonial divisions really set the stage. But what about Belize? That one seems a bit more unusual, right? Tucked away there on the Yucatan Peninsula.
Yeah, Belize is a very interesting case. Its history is so tied to British colonialism. Unlike Guatemala, which was part of the Spanish Empire, Belize was a British colony, originally known as British Honduras.
The British Empire, always leaving their mark on the map.
Yep.
So how did this former British colony end up as Mexico's neighbor?
It's a story of colonial rivalry, indigenous resistance, and eventually a negotiated settlement. The British first showed up in Belize back in the 1600s, drawn by the abundance of hardwoods like mahogany.
Oh yeah, I can picture those British ships loaded with mahogany, sailing back to Europe.
Exactly. Belize was a prime source for that valuable timber. But the British presence wasn't always welcome, you know. The indigenous Maya people who'd lived there for centuries, they resisted British encroachment.
So it wasn't just a peaceful takeover.
Not at all. The Maya fought to defend their land and resources. But over time, the British gradually gained control. And by the 18th century, Belize was firmly a British colony.
So where does Mexico fit into all of this? Were they involved in these conflicts with the Maya and the British?
Well, Mexico as an independent nation didn't really come into play until much later. Remember, they gained independence from Spain in 1821, and Belize remained a British colony well into the 20th century.
Ah, so two different colonial timelines converging.
Yeah.
So how did Mexico and Belize eventually decide on a border?
It was a long process. Diplomacy, treaties, some lingering disagreements. Mexico, as the successor to New Spain, they initially claimed sovereignty over Belize, arguing it was historically part of their territory.
Right, invoking those old Spanish claims. But I doubt the British were just going to hand over their colony.
Of course not. They held on to their claim, based on their long history there.
So how did they break this deadlock?
Well, luckily, diplomacy prevailed. In 1893, Mexico and Great Britain signed a treaty defining the border between Mexico and British Honduras.
So a peaceful resolution, at least on paper. But were there still some issues despite the treaty?
There were some lingering disagreements. Even though the treaty established a boundary, some aspects of the border remained contested for decades. Mexico, while acknowledging British control over Belize, they still kind of held on to that historical claim.
So even though a line was drawn on the map, things weren't totally settled.
Right. And this border issue got tangled up with Belize's push for independence. They wanted to secure their borders and be recognized internationally.
So Belize's independence was key to resolving the border issue.
Yeah, pretty much. Belize gained independence in 1981, and soon after, Mexico and Belize started new negotiations to formally establish the border and open diplomatic relations.
Wow, the birth of a nation reshaping the geopolitical map. So did they finally manage to agree on a border?
They did. In 1990, they signed a treaty. This treaty definitively established the border and paved the way for full diplomatic relations between the two countries.
So from colonial disputes to independence movements to a final agreement. What a journey.
It really shows how borders are more than lines on a map. They represent history, culture, politics, all these complex forces interacting.
Well said. So we've covered a lot of ground today, haven't we? From the fall of the Aztec Empire to the struggle for independence, from the the tumultuous relationship with the U.S. to those complex negotiations with Guatemala and Belize. It's been quite a deep dive.
It has. What stands out to me is how these historical events, they still shape the relationship between Mexico and its neighbors today, like the legacy of the Mexican-American War. It still influences discussions about immigration, trade, security, all along that U.S.-Mexico border.
The past is never really past, is it?
No, it's woven into the fabric of the present. And even though borders might seem fixed on a map, they're often contested spaces reflecting the interplay of history, culture, and politics.
It's a good reminder that understanding history is crucial for understanding the present.
Absolutely. And I encourage everyone listening to keep exploring this topic, delve deeper into those stories behind the borders. They shape our world in ways we might not even realize.
Great advice. And for our listeners, if you want to learn more, be sure to check out the show notes. We've got links to further reading and resources on Mexican history. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.
Thank you for watching Episode 3 of Rise of a Nation, The Journey of Independence and Expansion. If you enjoyed this podcast, please like and subscribe for more. Write in the comments what country's independence and expansion you would like me to cover next.